So you got some tip money in your tip jar and it's the end of the night and it's time to pay everyone. How should you deal with that tip money? Should it go to just the singer only? Or should it go to the person who booked the gig? Or should it be divided evenly among the band members? Well, let's talk about it. Hey, and welcome to Music Space, where we help working musicians just like you learn how to quickly and easily make a living with your craft. So if you're new here to the channel, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. That way you'll be notified when new videos are uploaded. So there are so many musicians and bands who get into it over how tip money is dealt with. I've heard of bands breaking up and even coming to fist fights over how tips were dealt with in the band. It's one of those things that anytime you're dealing with money, you have the potential to have problems, and rightfully so. A lot of times you're dealing with people's livelihoods. Musicians play for money, and some musicians see money as more important than others do. So giving a band member their portion of a tip jar, however small it may be, could be something that's more important to them and more serious to them than you may think. Now you couple this with the fact that some musicians are really greedy and selfish and only think about themselves, you have a recipe for disaster. So there are very common stories where things happen like the lead singer just grabs the tip jar and leaves with it and doesn't give an explanation of, who is going to get the tip money. They just literally leave with the tip jar. You have situations where you've played the entire night and you've seen the tip jar be filled up, and then at the end of the night, it just miraculously disappears and no one even says anything about it, not even the person that hired you. And these situations are simply not good for building trust and building camaraderie and building a tight band. So the question becomes, how should tip money be dealt with that makes it a good situation for everyone involved? Well, right before we get to that answer, if you're getting value out of this video so far, or if you get value out of my videos on this channel, do me a quick favor and subscribe to the channel and like this video. Go ahead and do that now. That lets me know that you appreciate this content, and it lets me know what type of content I should make for you in the future. Okay, so how should you deal with tip money? Well, let me answer that. And I'm also going to give you 3 tips to get more money in your tip jar at the end of this video. So be sure to stick around for that. So I'll share a couple of ways as to how to approach this whole thing. So the easiest way is the most obvious way to do this, which is to simply split the tips evenly amongst band members in all situations. And you do this across the board. And when I say all situations, I literally mean all situations. So for example, if you have a band member that shows up late for a gig, 30 minutes late or something like that, then that band member is still entitled to get their fair share of tips, just like everybody else in the band. Or if you have a particular band member that does more work on this gig than other band members, then that band member only gets their fair share of tips as well. And again, this is the most easiest way. It keeps you from having to think about it. It keeps you from having to try to, come up with systems to try to devise who is going to get what and all of that. So this is one approach that you can take to tip jar money. And that leads me to another way to approach this, and that is simply to establish whatever tip jar rules you're going to have in place beforehand. And you communicate those rules to everybody in your band and everybody you hire. And again, you do this beforehand. Now, I will say that whatever rules you decide to put in place, even though that you're gonna, tell everybody beforehand, you still need to approach it with a sense of fairness and equality in what you're doing. But if you decide, for example, that the lead singer does the most work in the band and that they should have the higher percentage of the tips that come in, or that they should get the entire tip jar, then again, that's something you need to communicate with the band members and people you hire before the gig, before they get to the performances and start seeing the tip jar fill up and thinking some of that money is going to come to them. Because what happens is a lot of times this is why issues arise, because people get to the gig and they see that tip jar filling up and it's like, oh, we got some great tips tonight. And then at the end of the night, the tip jar is gone. Like nobody has said anything. Nobody said anything to them beforehand. So it's absolutely okay to have whatever rules you're going to have in place for your tip jar money and how it's going to be distributed. Again, it's just important to be upfront with people and allow them to know that information before they get to the gig and start expecting something different. And the thing is, the people that you hire may not agree with the rules that you have in place, but at least you're being fair to them and you're being upfront with them by letting them know what the situation is going to be before they get into it. And I'll also say that it's probably a good thing to stay consistent with whatever rules you put in place. It's probably not a good thing that, say, on night 1, the lead singer gets most of the tips, and then on night 2, the drummer did a killer solo, so then, it's arbitrarily decided that he gets most of the tip money, and then on night 3, it's divided evenly among the band members. So that sort of inconsistency doesn't give musicians a chance to know what's going to happen when they get there and what's going to be consistent when they play gigs with you. It makes it really difficult for musicians to know what they're going to get from you at any given time, and this sort of inconsistency breeds disloyalty and distrust. So again, just always strive to be as fair as you possibly can, and be upfront and be forthcoming about whatever tip jar rules that you have with the musicians that are in your band and the musicians that you hire. And try to stay as consistent as you possibly can with whatever rules you decide to put in place with your tip money. Now, I promised you I was going to give you 3 tips on how to keep your tip jar full at your gigs, and here they are. So the first thing is never have an empty tip jar. Always do what's called greasing the tip jar with your own money. What you want to do is when you're setting your tip jar up on stage, drop some 5s and 10s or 20s or 1s, whatever you want to put in there so that people understand that this is your tip jar. This literally lets people know what that container or that vase you have on stage is for. And tip number 2 is you have to let patrons know that you have a tip jar and that you're accepting tips, and you need to let them know often. I know you don't want to come off as if you're begging for money or anything like that, but you have to let people know what you want. I mean, one thing is that people are coming and going all night in these venues, and it may be a different set of people there from when you first announced that you have a tip jar. So, even 30 minutes later that, you have a different set of people in that club or in that restaurant. So I would shoot for announcing that you're accepting tips and that you have a tip jar a minimum of about 5 to 7 times a night, ideally more than that. Now, the third tip may seem kind of obvious, but you need to put your tip jar in a place that can be seen and that's easily accessible. You do not want patrons and people in that, establishment to have to work to find or get to your tip jar. You'd really be surprised how many musicians and bands put their tip jars in these weird, hard to reach places. Patrons have to climb over cables and equipment, and some of them even have to come up on stage like behind the guitar player or something like that to try to get to your tip jar. And guess what? A lot of people that would normally tip won't tip because they don't want to have to go through that. And some people don't like to be seen, and coming up on stage with you brings attention to them, so they just choose to sit where they are and not tip. So use these 3 tips when you put your tip jar out on your gigs, and you're certainly to be set up to make more gigs and have a more full tip jar at the end of the night. But the question is for you. How do you deal with tips in your band, or how does the bands that you play with typically deal with their tip money? Jump down in the comment section and let me know. I definitely want to hear your thoughts on that. And listen, thank you so much for watching this video. I really do hope that it was helpful for you and that you gained some knowledge on, using your tip jar and how to get more tips on stage. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like this video. And here are some other videos that you can check out right now.